Today, we are going to explore a chilling and mysterious case that took place on the vast open sea. This story revolves around the Pescama and the events that unfolded in 1996. South Korea, a country surrounded by water on three sides, has a coastline stretching over 3,100 miles. As a result, the fishing industry is a crucial source of income for the nation. However, continuous fishing, along with environmental changes, has gradually depleted South Korea's coastal fishery resources. Many fishing companies were forced to look further offshore, venturing into distant waters. But deep-sea fishing is no easy task. The crew must not only endure the harsh challenges of the ocean, but also face trials of human nature that most people could never imagine. In 1996, a deep-sea fishing vessel set sail from a South Korean port, heading toward remote waters for its mission. No one could have predicted that a horrific tragedy was about to unfold on board. This was the case of the Pescama. The Pescama was a fishing vessel, measuring about 164 feet long and 26 feet high, with a gross tonnage of 254 tons. It was designed with 3 levels. The lowest level housed the engine room and the fish storage area. The middle level served as the crew's living quarters, including a dining area. The top level was reserved for the management team, the wheelhouse, and an equipment storage room. Although the ship was registered in Honduras, a Central American country, its actual owner was a South Korean seafood company. In 1996, this company began recruiting a crew for a new deep-sea fishing expedition, with the planned destination being the waters around the Phoenix Islands in the South Pacific, located between Australia and Hawaii. This region, with an average depth of 13,000 feet, is well known for its diverse and abundant marine life. Today, the Phoenix Islands Protected Area is the largest marine reserve in the world. This particular voyage of the Pescama was part of a 2-year tuna fishing operation in the area. According to the plan, the vessel would depart from Busan, South Korea, and cross the vast Pacific Ocean to reach its fishing grounds. To prevent crew members from abandoning the mission midway, the company required each sailor to sign a contract and put down a deposit. This deposit would be fully refunded upon completing the 2-year contract. Additionally, each crew member was offered a monthly salary significantly higher than the average wage of typical jobs. The lucrative pay attracted many applicants who were willing to submit their deposits. Soon, 24 crew members were selected. The majority were foreign workers, while only 7 were South Korean, most of whom held management positions on board, including Captain Choi Ki-taek, First Mate Lee In-sik, Manager Kang In-ho, Head Cook Seo Jong-soo, Chief Engineer Kim, 2 crew members, Park Jong-seung and Shin Hong-in. Captain Choi was 33 years old, still relatively young. However, he had years of experience at sea, earning the respect of even older crew members. Choi was known for his short temper and difficult personality. On a previous voyage, he had severely beaten an Indonesian sailor, leaving the man permanently unable to work at sea. The incident caught the attention of the Indonesian embassy, but Choi was never held criminally responsible. In the end, at the company's request, he wrote a letter of apology, and the matter was considered resolved. Yet now, Choi was once again appointed as the captain of the Pescama, leading the crew on their fishing expedition. Manager Kang was a towering figure, standing 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighing around 287 pounds. He had previously served as a sergeant in the Marine Corps and was known for following the captain's orders without question. Kang was extremely aggressive toward everyone, striking fear into the entire crew. First Mate Lee was the youngest of the South Korean managers at 27 years old. He had a mild-mannered personality and got along well with the foreign crew members. However, like everyone else, he feared the hot-tempered captain and the intimidating manager Kang. Aside from the 7 South Korean crew members, the remaining 17 consisted of 10 Indonesians and 7 Chinese sailors. The 7 Chinese crew members were Kwan Zai-gen, Lee Chun-chung, Bai Zong-fan, Kui Ri-kui, Jing Hao, Kui Wen-feng, and Piao Jun-nan. They were all ethnic Koreans from Tonghua, Jilin, China. Before boarding the ship, their families had struggled to gather the 20,000 RMB deposit required by the contract. If they completed the 2-year term, they would be fully refunded and receive a monthly salary of 1,500 RMB, significantly higher than the average wage in China at the time. Because they could communicate with the South Korean crew, many ethnic Koreans in China sought employment with South Korean fishing companies to work at sea. However, most of them lacked formal seamen's licenses and had no prior experience at sea. Among the 7 Chinese sailors, Zai Gen, at 44 years old, was the only one with previous maritime experience. Born into an ordinary farming family, he joined the military after finishing middle school. After being discharged, he returned to his hometown to farm, and later studied independently to pass the college entrance exam. He eventually became an elementary school teacher in his village, but his salary was meager, only 500 RMB per month. 2 years earlier, Zai Gen's mother had developed heart disease, and he also had 3 young children to support. His combined income from farming and teaching was not enough to cover living expenses. One day, he heard that working on a fishing vessel could earn him good money, so he decided to give it a try. After more than a year at sea, he returned home with 50,000 RMB, an amount far greater than what he could have earned otherwise. He used the money to pay for his mother's medical treatment. After experiencing the financial rewards of deep-sea fishing, when he heard that a South Korean fishing company was recruiting crew members this year, Zai Gen saw it as an opportunity to make more money while he was still physically capable. He applied and was accepted as a crew member of the Pescama. Among the 7 Chinese sailors, Zai Gen was the oldest, the most educated, and the only one with experience at sea. Naturally, he became the leader of the group. On Monday, June 3, 1996, the Pescama quietly departed from Busan, South Korea, officially beginning its 2-year deep-sea fishing expedition. The ship's first destination was Tinian Island in the western Pacific Ocean, located south of the Mariana Islands near Saipan. At this point, only the South Korean managers and the Indonesian crew members were on board. They planned to pick up the 7 Chinese sailors at Tinian Island. While the ship made its way there, the 7 Chinese sailors, led by Zai Gen, flew from Beijing to Seoul, then from Seoul to Saipan, and finally from Saipan to Tinian. On June 16th, after 13 days at sea, the Pescama finally arrived at Tinian Island in the western Pacific. The 7 Chinese sailors boarded the vessel there. Now the full crew of 24 was assembled. The ship then set course at full speed toward its final destination, the waters around the Phoenix Islands in the South Pacific. Because Zai Gen had 1 year of prior maritime experience, he was immediately appointed by Captain Choi as the second mate, alternating shifts with First Mate Lee In-sik in charge of the wheelhouse. The rest of the new sailors were not as fortunate. Having never experienced the harsh conditions of the open sea, most of them felt unwell. By the next morning, all of them were seasick, vomiting uncontrollably. However, Captain Choi Ki-taek and manager Kang In-ho showed no concern. Instead, they immediately began their onboard training. All foreign crew members were ordered to line up and practice tying fishing lines. However, calling it training would be an exaggeration. It was more like forcing them to figure it out on their own. The South Korean managers paced behind them, closely monitoring their progress. The foreign sailors from China and Indonesia had received little to no formal training beforehand. Seasickness and exhaustion made them weak, causing their movements to be slow and clumsy. Manager Kang was extremely displeased with this. He began shouting and kicking each of them in the backside. The sailors felt both humiliated and angry, but seeing Kang's towering and muscular frame, they remained silent, lowered their heads, and continued working. Seeing them obedient, Kang's expression suddenly changed. He was no longer as stern as before. Turning to Chung, a Chinese sailor who was tying lines, he asked, "Do you have any children?" The crew members had only just boarded the ship and didn't know much about each other yet. Chung assumed Kang was trying to make small talk, so he answered honestly, "My wife just got pregnant." Kang In-ho smirked and asked with a sinister tone, "Then where did your child come from?" Chung didn't understand the implication and replied, "Of course, from my wife's belly." Kang walked closer, patted Chung's head and sneered, "Are you sure it didn't come out of your bitch's ass?" Chung was stunned. He hadn't expected Kang to humiliate him so openly in front of everyone, and was momentarily at a loss for words. Similar incidents continued throughout the day. Nearly every foreign sailor was verbally abused by Manager Kang. They assumed it was because they weren't meeting expectations with their fishing line work, so they didn't dare resist. Instead, they endured it in silence, unaware that, in the eyes of the South Koreans, these foreign sailors were nothing more than lowly workers to be ordered around and mocked at will. Feng, a Chinese sailor, was particularly cunning. After realizing that resistance was futile, he started flattering the South Korean managers. He praised Captain Choi and Manager Kang, calling them extraordinary men. Feng went out of his way to ingratiate himself with the South Korean management, hoping to avoid further humiliation. On June 18th, the third day since the Chinese sailors had boarded the ship, the crew continued practicing tying fishing lines on the deck. Manager Kang was still dissatisfied with their progress. That day, he didn't just verbally abuse them. He began using his fists, striking them in the neck and back. He even took a fishing line and whipped Fan, a Chinese sailor, across the head. It seemed that the South Korean officers were pushing the foreign sailors' tolerance to its limits. On June 19th, the fourth day on board, the line-tying drills continued, and so did Kang's violence. While inspecting the crew's work, he noticed that Norman, an Indonesian sailor, had tied a fishing line too loosely. Enraged, Kang grabbed the line and whipped Norman across the face several times. His eye immediately swelled shut. Within just 4 days, nearly every foreign sailor on the Pescama had suffered Kang In-ho's beatings, except for Zai-gen. Because of his previous experience at sea, his quick work, and his position as the ship's second mate, Kang hadn't yet found an excuse to go after him. On the morning of June 20th, the fifth day, the crew woke up, washed up as usual, and prepared for breakfast before continuing their training. Jing Hao pulled Zai-gen aside and whispered, "You need to be careful. I just heard Manager Kang bad-mouthing you in front of Captain Choi Ki-taek. He said he wants to beat you until you bleed. I don't know why." Zai-gen didn't know if this was true or not, nor did he understand why Kang would want to attack him. But over the past few days, he had seen every foreign sailor on board get beaten with his own eyes. He figured it was better to believe it and prepare than to ignore the warning. He reminded himself to be extra cautious that day. By noon, Manager Kang called Zai-gen into the ship's storage area. As soon as Zai-gen stepped inside, Kang mumbled insults under his breath before suddenly punching him straight in the face. Blood immediately gushed from Zai-gen's nose. It was only the fifth day at sea, and the final destination was still far away. Knowing he had no choice, Zai-gen forced a weak smile and tried to brush it off. But Kang wasn't finished. He landed another punch before sneering, "Did you really think just because I didn't hit you 2 days ago I wouldn't hit you at all?" Zai-gen had no choice but to wipe the blood from his nose and bow his head in apology. At this point, every single foreign sailor on the Pescama had been beaten at least once by Kang In-ho. They had all undergone what could only be described as a test of submission. On board, the wages of South Korean sailors were vastly different from those of the foreign crew. Unlike the foreign sailors who received a fixed salary, the South Korean sailors were paid based on the ship's total catch. In other words, the more fish they caught, the more money they made. Because of this, they believed the most effective way to increase productivity was through beatings and verbal abuse. Among the foreign sailors, both the Chinese and the Indonesians suffered humiliation. However, there was a key difference. The Indonesian sailors couldn't understand the insults, while the Chinese sailors, all ethnic Koreans, understood every single word. Each insult cut deep. In the following days, the South Korean officers didn't stop their beatings and verbal abuse. Instead, the violence escalated even further. On June 22nd, the seventh day on board, the line-tying drills continued. Manager Kang constantly searched for reasons to assault the sailors. That day, he noticed Fan, a Chinese sailor, miscounting the number of fishing lines in a basket and immediately punched him in the head. It had only been 2 days since Fan was last beaten with a fishing line, and he collapsed onto the deck instantly. After a while, he regained consciousness, but later in the day, he vomited blood several times. The other sailors were deeply concerned for his condition, But with no doctor on board, they had no idea what to do. The violence didn't stop there. Captain Choi believed that all the foreign sailors were tying fishing lines too slowly. As punishment, he ordered them to kneel on the deck while the South Korean sailors took turns hitting them with wooden sticks, 3 strikes per person. After the beating, the foreign sailors struggled to stand up and prepare to return to work. At that moment, Manager Kang grabbed a plastic container filled with fish bait and hurled it at them. Ri Kui, a Chinese sailor, and an Indonesian crew member didn't dodge in time and were struck, causing severe bleeding. Despite everything, none of them dared to resist. Their main concern was reclaiming their deposit money and receiving their contracted wages. To do that, they had to survive the 2-year term. So, they endured the abuse in silence, trapped in a daily cycle of exhausting labor and humiliation. By June 26th, some of the Chinese sailors could no longer bear the brutality. They realized that if things continued like this, they might not survive long enough to reclaim their deposits. Desperate, they gathered to discuss possible solutions. Zai Jian, being the oldest, was even less tolerant of the mistreatment. In his previous fishing trip, he had witnessed violence from South Korean managers, but never to this extreme. On the Pescama, all decisions were dictated by the captain. The sailors decided to appeal directly to Captain Choi. However, they knew his violent temper. Anyone who confronted him risked being beaten even more severely. Fearing the consequences of speaking up, they chose instead to write a letter. In it, they promised to work hard and do their jobs well, while also expressing their hope that Captain Choi and Manager Kang would stop the beatings. Among the 7 South Korean officers, there was only one who had never laid a hand on the foreign crew: First Mate Lee. He maintained a relatively good relationship with the foreign sailors. Because of this, the Chinese crew entrusted him with the letter, asking him to deliver it to the captain. However, First Mate Lee was also terrified of Captain Choi's temper. He didn't dare hand over the letter immediately. Instead, he decided to wait a few more days, hoping to approach the captain when he was in a better mood. Time passed. In the early hours of June 27th, the 12th day since the Chinese sailors boarded the ship, at around 5 a.m., while the sky was still dim, Manager Kang forced the foreign sailors awake, ordering them onto the deck to prepare the fishing lines. They were using long-line fishing, a widely used method for catching tuna in the South Pacific. The long lines stretched for dozens of miles and consisted of a main line with multiple branch lines attached at regular intervals. Each branch line carried a baited hook. The entire system contained around 2,500 hooks. Before the lines could be deployed into the ocean, the sailors had to bait each hook one by one, an extremely time-consuming and labor-intensive process. As the crew worked, Captain Choi Ki-taek and Manager Kang In-ho paced around, supervising them closely. When Kang saw that Jing-hao was baiting hooks too slowly, he began shouting at him relentlessly. Then, he picked up a wooden stick and struck Jing-hao twice on the head. Blood started dripping from Jing-hao's head and ears, but he didn't dare stop working, fearing another beating. Meanwhile, Captain Choi noticed that Fan had placed the bait incorrectly. Without warning, he grabbed a few fish and hurled them at Fan's head and back. Caught off guard, Fan became even more flustered. Choi stormed over and kicked him to the ground, then delivered 2 more kicks to his stomach. Fan let out a cry of pain. Hearing the sound, Chang, another Chinese sailor, instinctively glanced over, only to be noticed by Choi. Immediately, Choi picked up a fish from the deck and flung it at Chang. It struck him in the face, causing his nose to bleed. But Choi wasn't finished. He grabbed more fish and continued throwing them at him. Chung, acting on instinct, began dodging. Seeing Chung dare to evade, Choi Ki-taek's rage intensified. He picked up an iron pipe from the deck and charged at Chung. Up until now, the South Korean officers had mostly used their fists for beatings, or at most, lighter objects like fishing lines. This was the first time they had seen the captain wielding a metal weapon. The crew immediately realized the situation had escalated far beyond what they had faced before. A deep, primal fear gripped them. That fear slowed their movements, and some even stopped working entirely. Seeing this, Choi roared, "Why aren't you working? Are you all trying to rebel? He then ordered all foreign sailors to kneel on the deck for punishment. Chung, the one who had just been chased down, was the first to be beaten. Choi noticed that he wasn't kneeling properly and immediately swung the iron pipe at his head. Chung instinctively tilted his head to avoid the blow, and the pipe smashed into his shoulder instead. He felt the sheer force of the strike. If it had landed on his head, he might have died on the spot. Until now, all the previous beatings had been punishments. But this was something else. Chung realized that the captain wasn't just disciplining them anymore. He wanted to kill him. Unable to endure the humiliation and violence any longer, Chung sprang up, wrestled the iron pipe from Choi's hands, and locked his arm around the captain's neck. The South Korean officers immediately reacted. They grabbed wooden sticks, fish knives, and whatever tools were within reach, preparing to attack Chung. Seeing the danger, a few Chinese sailors picked up tools from the deck and cautiously stepped forward, ready to defend him. Despite being in a chokehold, Captain Choi didn't back down. He bellowed to Manager Kang, "Grab the emergency axe and hack these beggars to death." Realizing that Choi might actually go through with it, Zai-gen and First Mate Lee rushed in to intervene. Zai-gen pleaded with the captain, begging him to let them leave the ship. They no longer cared about the 20,000 RMB deposit. Surviving was more important than the money. Ching, still holding Choi, shouted, "We wrote you a letter. All we asked was for you to stop beating us, and we promised to do our work. Why are you still doing this?" Standing nearby, First Mate Lee suddenly remembered the letter and quickly explained that he had never given it to the captain. As the situation grew more volatile, the Chinese sailors declared that they were willing to forfeit their deposits and leave the ship to save their lives. The Indonesian crew members also voiced their desire to leave. Within moments, every single foreign sailor on board demanded to go on strike and abandon the vessel. Captain Choi Ki-tak knew very well that with only a few South Korean sailors, they would never be able to complete the fishing mission assigned by the company. Because of this, his attitude began to change. He told the foreign crew that as long as they worked hard and fulfilled their fishing duties, he and Kang would stop beating them. Hearing this, the Chinese sailors calmed down. They agreed to continue working. After all, 20,000 RMB was not a small sum for them. For a while, the South Korean officers indeed stopped physically abusing the Chinese sailors. However, the violence against the Indonesian sailors continued, and life for the Chinese crew did not improve much either. They were assigned workloads far beyond their physical limits. Over the next month, they worked under extreme conditions, sleeping less than 3 hours a day. Only Feng, the flatterer, occasionally managed to slip away from work and rest a little longer. Zai-gen and Manager Kang were assigned to alternating shifts. However, every time it was Kang's turn to watch over operations, he dumped all the work on Zai-gen and went to the mess hall to drink. This left Zai-gen with barely any time to rest. One night during his shift, he was so exhausted that he nearly fell overboard. Chung, the sailor who had previously resisted, was deliberately assigned to sleep near the cold storage. Every night, he shivered from the freezing temperatures. Everyone knew this was a calculated punishment by the South Korean officers. After enduring this treatment for a month, they realized they couldn't continue like this. If they did, they would collapse from exhaustion. By July 27th, more than a month after the Chinese sailors had boarded the ship at 2 a.m., Zai-gen returned to his bed, struggling to fall asleep as he reflected on everything they had endured. Finally, he decided to submit a report, claiming he had bladder stones and could no longer work, requesting to leave the ship. He handed the report to First Mate Lee, hoping he would pass it to the captain. Following Zai-gen's lead, 6 of the 7 Chinese sailors, all except Feng, also requested to leave. Feng had betrayed them to protect himself, but the remaining 6 stood united. The next morning, Captain Choi summoned Zai-gen to accompany him as he transferred an Indonesian sailor named Louis to a returning fishing vessel. Louis, too, could no longer endure the abuse and had requested to leave. Initially, the captain refused, but Louis was determined, even going as far as threatening him with a knife. In the end, Choi had no choice but to let him go. When they arrived at the returning fishing boat, Choi leaned in and whispered to its captain, "That scum dared to threaten me with a knife. Toss him into the sea on the way back." Zai-gen overheard every word. He realized that Choi was even more ruthless than he had imagined. He immediately relayed the conversation to his fellow Chinese sailors, strengthening their resolve to get off the ship. Later, Zai-gen went to the wheelhouse on behalf of the Chinese sailors and directly demanded that they be allowed to leave and return home immediately. Instead of responding, Captain Choi simply told him to gather all the Chinese sailors. Faced with continuous abuse from the captain, the sailors had lost all patience. They no longer tried to explain themselves. They simply stated that they refused to work any longer. Even if they couldn't get their deposit money back, they were determined to leave the ship. Choi remained silent and didn't respond immediately. 2 days later, the 6 Chinese sailors approached Captain Choi Ki-taek again, demanding to leave the ship. To their surprise, this time, Choi agreed almost too easily. However, he set one condition. Before they could disembark, each sailor had to sign and fingerprint a written statement confirming that they were voluntarily requesting to leave, not because of any physical abuse. The sailors were desperate to return home and could no longer endure their situation. Without hesitation, they agreed to Choi's condition. First, Mate Lee drafted the statement, and all 6 Chinese sailors, except for Feng, signed and provided their fingerprints. Once they had finished signing, they handed the document to the captain. But the moment Choi received it, his demeanor changed. Smirking triumphantly, he sneered, "You pathetic dogs, did you really think I was afraid of you? I played you all. If you had claimed I beat you, the company would have disciplined me and held me responsible for the damages. But now that you've officially admitted you're leaving voluntarily, it's your turn to suffer." The 6 sailors immediately sensed that something was wrong, but it was already too late. It turned out that this was not a simple release form, but a confession of guilt. The document stated that the 6 Chinese sailors had disobeyed Captain Choi and Manager Kang, refused to work, armed themselves with weapons, and attempted to kill the captain, and as a result, Choi was forced to remove them from the ship. Choi then told them that the ship was nearing Samoa. With this confession in hand, he could easily report them to the authorities. Once they were turned over to the police, they would be imprisoned in a Samoan jail. Samoa, located in the South Pacific, was well known for its rich tuna fishing grounds, one of the key locations for the Pescama's fishing operations. For the sailors, what was supposed to be a promised land for fishing was now about to become their prison. If they were arrested, they would be detained for at least 3 months. All imprisonment costs and the fuel expenses for diverting the ship to Samoa would be charged to them. Combined with the loss of their deposit money and their previous travel expenses, each sailor would owe at least 100,000 RMB. For them, farmers from rural China, this was an unimaginable amount. It meant they could spend the rest of their lives in a Samoan prison. Hearing Choi's words, the 6 sailors realized they had been tricked. An argument broke out between them and the captain, but the South Korean officers had already anticipated resistance. They had set a trap. Hidden in the shadows, waiting for their moment, stood Manager Kang, Park Jong-sung, Head Cook Seo Jang-soo, Engineer Kim Chang-yeol, and Sailor Shin Hung-il. All 5 men were armed with iron rods, long knives, and axes. The moment the argument started, the 5 of them emerged from the darkness and positioned themselves behind Captain Choi, ready to strike at any moment. To further pressure the Chinese sailors, one of the South Koreans taunted them. "You've been at sea this long, and all you've caught is 30 tons of tuna? You lazy, broke bastards. You owe us for the damages." Realizing they had walked into a trap, the 6 Chinese sailors had no choice but to retreat from the wheelhouse. After calming down, they did the math. The amount they were being forced to pay was an impossible sum. Some of them felt as if the sky was crashing down on them. There was no way they could ever come up with that kind of money. Out of options, they turned to the only South Korean officer who had ever shown them kindness, First Mate Lee. He was their last hope. Zai-gen spoke to Lee in a sympathetic tone. "We are countrymen, we speak the same language. Why make things so difficult for each other?" He pleaded with Lee to say a few words on their behalf to the captain, but Lee refused. He explained that if he intervened, the captain would certainly punish him as well. Thinking of another way, Zai Gen decided to offer Captain Choi a box of Angong Niu Huang Wan, a traditional Chinese medicine his family had given him before he boarded the ship. The medicine was known for its ability to reduce inflammation and detoxify the body, and it was so expensive that he had never brought himself to use it. Handing the medicine to Choi, Zai Gen said, "My family is very poor. There is no way we can afford that kind of money. Please, since we speak the same language, have some mercy on us and let the 6 of us leave." Choi did not take the medicine. Instead, he threw it out of the room. The Pescama did not change course. It continued heading toward Samoa. As time passed and they got closer to land, the pressure on the 6 Chinese sailors grew unbearable. 2 days after signing the forced confession, out of options, they sat together drinking, trying to drown their sorrows. They shared stories of their suffering over the past month. The more they talked, the angrier they became. One of them finally burst out, "Aren't these Koreans trying to kill us? They're too cruel. Everything that's happened to us, it's all because of them. We've suffered enough, and they still treat us like this. Those dogs don't deserve to live." No one could have imagined that these drunken words would soon become reality. August 2nd, 1996, Friday, 12:30 a.m. The Pescama encountered another fishing vessel at sea, the Dongwon No. 2. When the crew of the Dongwon No. 2 learned that the Pescama was heading toward Samoa, they made a request. They had a 19-year-old South Korean trainee, Choi Dong-ho, who was suffering from appendicitis. They wanted the Pescama to take him to Samoa for treatment at a hospital. The Pescama took the sick trainee aboard. The number of people on board increased to 25. That night, Zai Gen was on duty. At 1 a.m., he went to the wheelhouse to relieve First Mate Lee in sick for his shift. Half an hour later, Captain Choi arrived at the wheelhouse. Before leaving, he told Zai Gen, "If any news comes in from the other ships, wake me up." Then he left. At that moment, a dark thought formed in Zai Gen's mind. A while later, Zai Gen went to the captain's room and woke him up, telling him there was a message from another ship. Half asleep, Choi got up and followed Zai Gen to the wheelhouse. But before he could even pick up the phone, he was ambushed. Chung, Jing Hao, and Fan, who had been waiting in the shadows, stabbed him with knives. Choi fought back fiercely, but he was outnumbered. Overpowered, he was eventually subdued and thrown into the sea. Seeing that the plan had succeeded, Zai Gen called Manager Kang. The moment Kang stepped through the door, the sailors lunged at him with axes. But Kang was large and quick to react. He dodged the first strike and slammed the door shut, preparing to fight back. At that moment, Ri Kui, Jing Hao, and Jun Nan circled around from the other side of the wheelhouse. Together, they forced the door open and attacked Kang from behind. The 3 men overpowered Kang, killed him, and threw his body into the sea. They had clearly figured out a way to eliminate the South Korean officers. However, at that moment, Zai Gen spoke up. "Lee never hit us. He treated us well, and more importantly, he knows how to steer the ship. If we kill him, no one will be able to navigate. Lee must not be killed." The others agreed and decided to tie Lee up instead, locking him in the mess hall. Next, Park Jong-seung, head cook Seo Jang-soo, engineer Kim, and sailor Shin Hyung-il, all the remaining South Korean crew members, were killed and thrown overboard. By the time everything was done, the sun had risen. The Chinese sailors were sobering up. They had relied on alcohol to give them the courage to carry out the massacre. But now, with clear minds, they had to decide what to do next. At this point, the only people left on the Pescama were 6 Chinese sailors, led by Zai Gen 10 Indonesian sailors, 1 surviving South Korean sailor, First Mate Lee, 1 Chinese sailor, Feng, who had betrayed them, 1 South Korean trainee, Choi Dong-ho, who had been transferred aboard for medical treatment. During the night of the killings, the sounds of screaming had woken 3 Indonesian sailors. They stepped out of their quarters and witnessed the murders firsthand. But before they could react, They were subdued. Now, the 6 Chinese sailors debated what to do with them. Some suggested throwing them overboard. Zai Gen disagreed. Another suggested forcing the 3 Indonesian sailors to kill a South Korean crew member so they would become accomplices. Zai Gen agreed but insisted Lee must not be killed. Instead, the 3 Indonesian sailors were forced to throw Choi Dong-ho, the 6th South Korean trainee, into the sea. After that, the 6 Chinese sailors still felt uneasy. They worried that the 3 Indonesians and Feng, the Chinese traitor, could turn against them. So, Zai Gen devised a plan. At 7 a.m., under the bright morning sun, he called the 3 Indonesian sailors and Feng to the cold storage room, telling them to retrieve fish. As soon as all 4 entered, the door slammed shut. The cold storage was locked from the outside. The temperature inside could drop as low as -49 degrees Fahrenheit. However, due to a malfunction, it was only around 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the 4 prisoners pounded on the door, pleading to be released. 4 days passed. That evening, Zai Gen checked on them. Through the small opening, Feng begged for mercy. He promised to do anything to survive, even kill the Indonesian sailors if that's what it took. But Zai Gen showed no mercy. The next day, Feng and the 3 Indonesian sailors were thrown into the sea. Final death toll, 11 people. 6 South Korean officers, 1 South Korean trainee, 3 Indonesian sailors, 1 Chinese sailor, Feng, the traitor. Now, only 13 people remained on board. 6 Chinese sailors, led by Zai Gen's 7 Indonesian sailors. The Chinese sailors had officially taken control of the Pescama, but they knew that if they returned home, they would face execution. After careful discussion, the 6 of them decided to flee to Japan illegally. They ordered First Mate Lee, the only surviving South Korean, to change course toward Japan. To prevent any outside interference, Zai Gen destroyed all communication devices on the ship to make sure no one could secretly send out a message. Time passed. On August 20th, Lee noticed that the 6 Chinese sailors were secretly building 2 small boats using materials from the deck. However, the boats were only large enough for 6 people. A sense of dread crept over him. He realized they might be planning to kill everyone else on board to eliminate witnesses. Fearing for his life, Lee began looking for a way to escape before they turned on him. The Pescama continued sailing for another 4 days. On August 24th, the ship reached a location about 5 miles northwest of Minami Torishima, Japan. Due to fuel problems, the ship became unstable, tilting dangerously and risking capsizing. Lee seized the opportunity. He told the Chinese sailors that the instability was caused by an uneven weight distribution and ordered them to go into the fish storage hold to rearrange the cargo and stabilize the ship. Unaware of the trap, all 6 Chinese sailors entered the storage hold. Lee and the Indonesian sailors immediately shut the hatch and locked them inside. At that moment, Zai Gen reacted instantly. He managed to escape before the hatch fully closed and launched into a desperate fight against the Indonesian sailors. However, in his rush, he forgot to free his 5 fellow Chinese sailors in the storage hold. Outnumbered, Zai Gen was eventually overpowered, beaten, and tied up. An hour later, a Japanese fishing vessel appeared on the horizon. Lee jumped off the Pescama and swam toward the Japanese vessel, where he told the entire story. Lee and the 6 surviving Indonesian sailors were rescued. Shortly after, the Japanese Coast Guard intercepted the Pescama and arrested the 6 Chinese sailors, including Zai Gen-yu. They were handed over to South Korean authorities. The Pescama was also brought back to Busan. The case exploded in South Korean media, sparking nationwide outrage. Most people, unaware of the full story, were enraged at the 6 Chinese sailors, calling them butcher demons and demanding the death penalty as justice for the murdered South Korean crew. 2 months later, in December 1996, the case went to trial at the Busan District Court. The 6 Chinese sailors, Zai Gen, Cheng, Fan, Ri Kui, Jing Hao, and Jun Nan, were charged with murder, hiding corpses, piracy. The court ruled that their crimes were particularly heinous, given the high number of victims. All 6 were sentenced to death. the 6 men appealed the ruling. While in prison, Zai Gen wrote a 10,000-word petition detailing the abuse and humiliation they had suffered under the South Korean officers. He argued that these experiences were what drove them to commit the murders in a fit of rage. He also stated that after killing the South Korean officers, they never had any intention of harming innocent people, and he expressed no regret for sparing First Mate Lee. However, South Korean newspapers refused to publish his letter. A month later, the petition reached China. A newspaper in Liaoning province published the story, revealing details that had never been told before. Readers in China reacted strongly, believing the death sentence was unjust. Zhao Feng, a lecturer at the Liaoning Police Judicial Cadre Management Academy, and an ethnic Korean himself, was deeply moved. Determined to use his legal expertise to help his fellow countrymen, he reached out to 2 South Korean lawyers, Moon Jae-young and Roh Moo-hyun, from a law firm in Busan that frequently defended marginalized people. After learning about the case, Moon Jae-young felt that the 6 men had been wrongly convicted. Despite overwhelming public pressure, he decided to defend them. As soon as the news broke, the South Korean public lashed out at him, calling him a traitor to the nation. The appeal trial was held at the Busan High Court. During the trial, Moon Jae-young fiercely defended the 6 defendants. He presented evidence showing that the South Korean officers had a history of violence. He also argued that the defendants had killed out of anger and desperation due to the brutal treatment they endured. He stated, "Every human being has the right to live with dignity." The defense strategy worked. The appellate court upheld Zai Gen's death sentence as the mastermind of the crime. However, the other 5 sailors had their sentences reduced to life in prison. Because of this case, many South Koreans saw Moon Jae-young as a traitor for defending Chinese murderers of Korean descent. 3 months later, the defense team appealed again. However, the Supreme Court of South Korea rejected the appeal and upheld the verdict. Later, during Roh Moo-hyun's administration, Zai Gen's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. With that, the Pescama case was officially closed. Everyone involved had faced legal consequences. In the wake of the case, many South Korean fishing companies feared a repeat of the tragedy. As a result, they shifted their hiring efforts to countries like Vietnam, Laos, and others. However, the violence on fishing vessels did not stop. Over time, more and more similar incidents surfaced, drawing public attention to the harsh realities of the deep-sea fishing industry and even other labor sectors. And to this day, these issues still persist. So, what can we learn from this story? First, it is a strong condemnation of violence, no matter its form. Violence is never a solution, it only deepens suffering and hatred. Second, it highlights the importance of human rights protections, especially for those who are vulnerable and exploited. Finally, it reminds us of our responsibility to stand up for justice and fairness. Silence in the face of injustice only enables more suffering. We must speak out and take action to uphold human dignity and fairness. Only when we work together can we prevent tragedies like the Pescama case from happening again. That's the end of today's video. See you in the next one. Goodbye.